Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last but certainly not least day of DevOps conference. And today we have Michael Coté from VMware Tenzu and yours, Artem Semenov from Align Technology. And we will be talking surprise about Kubernetes. So, well, it's a DevOps conference, so how we can skip the topic, right? But conversation today will be interesting. So we will be talking about who is Kubernetes for? So who should be like the main users, the main customers? Because we like intention of Kubernetes was to make things simple, but that's not quite the thing once you start working with it. And as you may experience yourself, or you may hear from other talks on the conference, it can be really complex. So that's what we will be talking about today. And Michael, I know that you're going to introduce yourself in scope of your presentation, but is there anything that you want to share about yourself that is not really on your slide deck that called about me?
Oh, sure. I don't know if I want to, but it's at least interesting. But you know, when I get asked this question, I think like, what are some things that happened before the internet? Because those are definitely things people don't know about. And the first thing that popped into my head was the first car that I bought when I was in high school. And I was a teenager in the '90s, so that means that I bought like a car that's about 20 years old or so. And I bought a 1980. Monte Carlo with two gigantic big doors, and it was like powder blue, and it was great and very cheap because it was an old clunker. But so there's still some pictures of that, and I mentioned it. But the thing that people don't know, I guess, is that before I bought that car, I was very seriously considering getting a Pinto or a Gremlin, an even older car that just is ridiculous. If you ever seen like I think Wayne's World. I think Garth in there drives a Pinto or a Gremlin, just like a tiny. It's basically looks like if you blew a bubble and you push down one side of it, and then you put wheels on it. It's like a little weird car like that. But I'll have to go look those up after this talk. See why I passed on it.
Nice. Well, these days cars look so much the same. So I really miss a little bit the good old times when they were so different and we were still looking for the best design. Yeah. And before we start our presentation, just a quick reminder to our audience. So we have a chat. Feel free to ask questions there. Just type them with the hashtag question. We'll have some time to ask them right here, and then we'll move to a Zoom discussion after the talk. And we all chat online and try to have as much of the life experience that we are missing these days, being all in online format. So, Michael, what to you?
All right. Well, how about we start then? That sounds great. Thanks for coming to check out this talk. This is an area I like to ponder every year or so nowadays. You know, Kubernetes has been around for like 5 years or so, and the space that I work in, I used to work at Pivotal, and now I work at VMware. Basically, running containers and applications that are containers is a huge part of what we do. So I've been involved in this discussion for a long time. And I always like to check in every now and then and see like what the deal with this question is. Like, is Kubernetes something for developers to use or something for them not to use? Because there's all sorts of like different responses and answers as we were just going over that you end up seeing. So what I want to do here is kind of go through, it was great that this talk was accepted because I knew it would force me to kind of go re-research and kind of check in on this stuff. And so this is basically my little book report, if you will. Not actually a book report, but my little report on what the state of this question seems to be nowadays. If you want to, speaking of things people don't know, I did a version of this talk about 2 years ago, which I considered to be pretty awful. So I don't really publicize it anywhere, but you can find it if you want and compare and contrast. So as I was kind of alluding to, right, even nowadays, when this question is asked, the correct answer, the answer that comes out the most often is this depends answer, right? And, you know, I was a developer a long time ago. I know that is the best, most accurate answer to give to any question because you need to kind of figure out what your situation is and what it applies. but it's certainly not the fun, enjoyable answer, nor the most direct one. And this came up most recently, thinking about this topic. Like I've been kicking this around for the past couple of months in my head. We had a conference called DevOps Loop, another DevOps one a while ago, and we had a panel at the end of the day. And I got to suggest some of the questions, and I asked that very question: Is Kubernetes for developers? And you can go you can't click on it now, but you can kind of go check out that panel, and you can see that the state of the art of the answer as of 30 days ago was it depends, right? Which they explain it quite well. But I think it's fun to go through the exercise of like, let's really try to force the question. And then if we find an answer to it, let's think about what to do about that, right? Like what would the next steps be? And I think, I'm not going to do that here, but it'd be fun to have a parallel presentation, if you will, that was about that it is for developers, and see if you could put that case together. So just a little bit about myself. That's me, just to line up there. Usually I wear that same t-shirt or shirt when I present, but I'm not right now. But as mentioned, I've worked at VMware and Pivotal before that for quite some time now. And I was an industry analyst, and I did corporate strategy at Dell on software and cloud. And I was a software developer for about 10 years, back when I lived in Austin, in Texas, for some time. But what I've really settled on, and kind of like, I guess you could call it like the third phase of my career, what I do is I really like to study how large organizations in particular, how they're getting better at doing software to run their business better. I don't know. Sometimes people call that digital transformation, depending on if they're interested in software versus desktops or whatever. But that's what I try to collect together and discuss with people. I mean, usually on the order of around 150, 200 sort of executives and people I talk with each year, to really have a good discussion with them about like, so how's it going? Changing the way you're doing software to make it something that you can do on a weekly basis, to be more product centric, be more DevOpsy and agile and waterfall, all these kinds of things. So I've collected together a lot of that stuff in these books I've written over the past 3 years, which you can get a copy of if you're really interested. There's all the info there. And I do a couple of podcasts nowadays. I do a weekly one. I'm going to record later on tonight, just about software infrastructure, called Software Defined Talk. And I do some for work as well, if you're interested in that kind of stuff. But that's who I am, and my credentials to some extent. So I like to start with conclusions. Or just kind of like things to keep in mind, right? Like it's fun to kind of go through a train of thought and then come to a conclusion. And then when you sort of present it, put those at the beginning. I always found this helpful because then it means when people go over these conclusions, I can decide to just kind of tune out or just leave altogether. So at least you kind of pick up the gist of things. But I think when I've kind of looked through this question, is Kubernetes for developers again recently, there's some three conclusions is a bit strong of a word, but there's three kind of things that I've arrived at. And that is, one, that the larger your organization, chances are the further you want your developers from Kubernetes, right? The more you want in between them. If what you're trying to focus on is the productivity of the developers, kind of if you'll pardon a businessy term, the value that they're bringing their organization with the software that they work on. And part of that is that, and I especially observe this a lot in large organizations, is the more variation, the more different, unique things that you're doing, which often amounts to the more you let developers do, the more difficult it is to manage that, as they say, estate, like all of that different stuff over time. And it ends up generating a tremendous amount of, in the SRE meaning of the word, but also in a almost economic sense of the word, a lot of waste in the system if you have a lot of variation at the infrastructure layer. And then part of that is, it's driven by, and as a former developer, I know this firsthand, is, developers really enjoy procrastinating by building platforms. They love that. Platforms, frameworks, any kind of thing that's not actually the application they should be working on. Developers are thrilled to work on that kind of stuff. And it makes sense, right? Because if you think about the sort of celebrities of the developer world, the well-respected people, I don't know if it's all of them, but a huge amount of them are not people who actually have built applications that have UIs. They're ones who have built frameworks and tools that developers use, right? So that's often the thing that developers look forward to. And it's also fun to write tools for yourself. But that fuels a lot of things. And despite that, you've got to somehow fight against that nature or facilitate developers enjoying focusing on the actual application layer instead of infrastructure things. So let's go through how I kind of arrived at those conclusions, if you will. So first of all, just to kind of sum up, I think there was a good little introduction at the beginning, kind of summarizing this. But whenever you look into the Kubernetes world, right, there's so many. I'll get to all the fantastic benefits that you get. But one of the first things you hit, especially if you talk to people from vendors like me who are trying to get you to buy stuff from us to solve your problems, is there's a lot of complaints and difficulties that people come up, right? So you can see a couple of from a couple of different surveys, like difficulties and challenges people have with doing it. There's, I think it's kind of there's the I forget what they call it, but the landscape that the Cloudnative, the CNCF uses. And I think there's a lot of kind of mischievous use of this landscape to kind of show like, oh, look at all the confusion and all the things that you can pick. But as I'll get to, I think it's actually great to have this much variety. But it is something that comes up that there's a lot of things to sort through, right? It's a very multi-room toy box to look through. And then, of course, there's just, straight up complaining about how things are complicated. And then the area that I'm often focused on the most, even when it comes to something as low level as Kubernetes or containers, right, is that all of this technology stuff is great, but really what the problem is the people. The culture needs to change, and that's all very hard, right? So this is kind of what several years ago set me on always asking this question every now and then is, there's a lot of complaints, right? Like for something that's like such a great technology and that so many people are interested in, it gets a lot of flack and a lot of people saying there's problems with it. So the response to that, and I think this starts to help us kind of investigate the question or ponder it, if you will, is when people complain about Kubernetes and how complicated it is and how involved it is, all sorts of things like that, right? The kind of response that comes up most frequently nowadays, and for several years, has been this idea, right? That Kubernetes is a great platform for building platforms, and I think that's accurate, right? Like if you, I was just watching a video. We have Joe Beda and Craig McLucky work in the part of VMware that I work in, and I was watching a talk that Craig was doing, and he brought this point up about the intentions and when they were building Kubernetes, what they were intending it for, right? And this is pretty genuine to what it was. And so I think if we start with that, we can kind of dig into what it is, how close developers should be to Kubernetes, if they should use it, how you should think for and plan around that. And the first thing we should be interested in asking is like, all right, so what's a platform, right? And this is from at the most recent KubeCon. There was a little sub day, the DevX day, which DevX is just like the current phrase that people use for developer experience, which is to say, making sure the stuff developers use has high usability and isn't awful to use. That's my definition, at least. And you get to do some camel casing, which is always fun. And there's the letter X. But I think this is a pretty good representation, kind of a modern one of everything that's in at least a Kubernetes platform, right? And if you really stare at it, you can see that the colors indicate who's responsible for what and like what kind of fits in here and there. And there's multiple things. But it's a good way of boiling down that landscape and all this complaining to kind of say, all right, here's what it looks like from a technology standpoint when we're talking about a platform, right? And this is the both types, since we have the app layer in here. And so the question becomes like, is this what we want developers being involved with, right? Like at what point do they get involved? What part do they touch? What do they not touch? Who does what? And how do we even think about how we're building that up, right? If we're building the platform, that implies building and assembling people together. Now, to seesaw between that's very complex and it's also very awesome. I guess it's sort of like learning, tuning your palate to find cheeses, right? It seems very complicated and difficult, but once you educate yourself, you can kind of like unlock the mystery and the delight of the complex cheese store and all the different fun that you can have there. But I think it is worth thinking about why it's good to go through the complexity of a platform. And so we kind of, the previous thing I kind of showed the components, the things that a platform does. But I think it's also worth discussing like what the benefits you get are, right? And this is one sort of benefit analysis, I guess, from the Puppet DevOps reports. If you remember, the DevOps report, as we would say in the open source world, forked several years ago between Puppet and Google, and so this is from the Puppet one. And they spend a lot of time. I think it's like 80 pages this year, so it's good bedtime reading. But they spend a fair amount of time going over the value of a platform. And this is the way that they kind of characterize the functionality that you get. And you can see that, the high performing, the better performing teams use more of these characteristics of a platform. And, one of the key things that I would pull out of here is it's worth going over the basics because people so often forget them because sometimes they're boring. But, I think the self-service nature of a platform for developers is one of the key things that a platform does for you, right? And, just to go back, it's kind of, when you think about it that simply, it's kind of astonishing that all of this goes into just making it so developers don't have to fill out tickets, which is kind of the most boiled down way that you can think about what a platform does for you. But, being less flippant, there's other things that it really does pull in for you. And nowadays, when people are talking about platform, I think a lot of what they're discussing is, to use another phrase, a cloud native platform, right? So they're talking about a platform that is geared around applications that are written and run on top of containers, that are orchestrated by a container orchestration layer like Kubernetes, and that are really relying on the technical benefits that a cloud native, a container-based application gives you. And this is also why it's really important to think through what a platform is, how you would put one together for yourself, because you really start to get to the benefits that you get that are beyond just the fun of building your own platform and kind of the thrill of being able to deploy your stuff quickly, right? So just to highlight, you can see some of them in a survey over there, our state of Kubernetes survey from this year. But if you think about the way that many organizations want to use their software, right? They use their software as like the core way, to put it in developer terms, to implement the idea of their business, right? So their business is just, from a developer standpoint, is a bunch of boxes and arrows and things moving around on a whiteboard, right? But then the software, in many instances, the software, the custom written software that an organization uses is how those boxes and arrows become a business. So you can, straighten your teeth without having to have a bunch of metal in your mouth across the entire supply chain. Whatever the case may be, do your insurance claims or things like that. But, a lot of that nowadays is either done in software or companies aspire to it. And when you're treating your software as like the core way that your business runs, a lot of the benefits that a cloud native architecture, an application, and therefore a platform, and therefore also Kubernetes, if that's what you want to build on there, a lot of it gets down to these types of benefits, which are, like I was just talking with some people yesterday, and their big concern with changing over to their software being critical to how they run was when the software breaks, right? That, they ran some commodity exchanges here and there, and they don't want that to break, right? So what's important, and the secret of software going down is it's important for everybody. Everyone's software is mission critical, right? Just some people prefer to think theirs is more mission critical than others. But what's built into cloud native platforms nowadays is that idea of resiliency, right? The idea, just to name one thing, that when we release software, what we can do is we could just release the software in we could do a progressive release, as James Governor over at Red Monk likes to say, or we can do a rolling upgrade where we only have like one person, then 5 people, then 10 people using the new version. And at some point we can switch over to it. And then if something goes wrong, we can very rapidly roll back things. I mean, obviously, it's not as simple as just wrapping your application in a container and then you get all these powers, right? There's a whole lot of architecting and sometimes even rewriting your application and setting things up to get to that point. But you get this ability from a platform to really have that agility in your infrastructure that has been very hard for organizations to have in the past, right? And the other things, that a platform tends to have that are definitely not part of Kubernetes, right? But that it relies on, or the build pipeline that you have, your CI/CD stuff, or your secure software supply chain, or whatever people want to call it nowadays, has all sorts of names. But there are genuinely great uses for a platform, so it's worth getting over those complaints of complexity and figuring out what to do about it. And I think, as I'll get into at the end, right? Like the other thing that is valuable about cloud native platforms is they actually, it's always risky to anthropomorphize or give non-human things human attributes. But in general, platforms really do want to be centralized and standardized, right? They tend to not really want to have multiple versions of them that are incompatible running everywhere, which I think is a lesson that we kind of learned way back, maybe not so way back in the OpenStack days. If you remember, there were many OpenStack instances stood up. And one of the core issues that organizations would have is that if they went off and customized their own OpenStack instance, it was very easy to become like 6 months behind the most recent release of OpenStack, 12 months behind, and then all of a sudden, next thing you know, you're running like a 5-year-old version of OpenStack, and you're having to spend a lot of time syncing up and getting all of the new features that you wanted into there. And then if you think about multiplying that in a 10,000, 100,000 person organization where you have multiple versions of a platform running instead of one nice centralized control way of doing stuff, you start to lose those benefits of platforms. But again, that's a lot of what goes into thinking about cloud native platforms nowadays. So in a brief way, this gives us an idea of what a platform is, right? So here we have Kubernetes, a platform for building platforms. And I think if you look at it, a lot of the Kubernetes people would say APIs, but I'm like a 1990s 2000 person, so when I hear APIs in reference to Kubernetes stuff, my mind gets a little confused. But there's a lot of great APIs and standardized ways of the atomic units, things like that Kubernetes has to create those building blocks that allow you to build a platform like this, in addition to, as I showed previously, all the other stuff to pile on top of there. So we've kind of sorted out what a platform is there. And then I think the next challenge, right? So is Kubernetes for developers, is to really focus on like, all right, so what are developers, right? And this is, as with all great arguments, or I shouldn't say arguments, as with all great trains of thought, how you define the terms that are used in the original question sort of very directly gets you to what the answer is going to be. So that's something fun you can use in your own conversations and rhetorical adventures, is make sure to always define the terms that you're using instead of letting someone else define it. But to that end, I will demonstrate. So when we're thinking about what a developer is, I think there are, depending on how you count it, I think there's probably 5 or 6 types of developers, probably some more depending on how you think about low code and Excel and things like that. But let's walk through them, because most people who talk, most of the time when all of us talk about developers, we usually mean, I think, one type of developers out of 5 or 6. So one, there's the developers I know nothing about, embedded developers who, like, I don't know, put software in brake systems or factories or something, right? Like it's software that actually goes into hardware. And I don't think we're talking about them, right? And then there's developers who, I would call them kernel developers, people who do systems programming. There's also developers who work on, hardware programming, BIOS things, and whatever it is racks do in data centers, like all of that kind of stuff. Then arguably there's sort of like data scientists, depending on, what you want to call them. And there's also the one that I think most people talk about are application developers. This is, as you can see from my wonderful explanation of other developers, this is the type of developer I was. So this is a developer who essentially, now there's exceptions, right? But basically an application developer's job is to move pixels around on the screen. Or if you have if you don't have a visual way of doing stuff, to move sounds around in the air, or whatever way of consuming the UI is so that it's accessible. But their job is to work on that interaction between a human and the system, right? The software that they're doing, your online banking systems, something as simple as checking in on reports, I don't know, making videos, all these types of things, right? So they generally are, I think, I haven't really gone to look this up in the analysis of it, but I think they compose the most amount of developers that are out there. Again, I guess if you threw in like Office and Excel and you called them programmers, they would probably be the most, which is fine. I don't know how to do macros in Excel, or I can't remember pivot tables, so I have respect for that. But I think application developers are the majority of developers out there. So if we settle on that for the question, right, I think that gets us a lot closer to figuring out, is Kubernetes for developers? But there's another type of developer that I think it turns the question to a yes. And that developer, you can call them a platform developer, an operations developer. If you don't really want to get into a lengthy conversation if this is accurate or not, you can call them a site reliability engineer. You can call them a DevOps engineer, whatever works for you, right? Like whatever it is that you're thinking of that is a developer who is building that platform, which, the answer to the question is right there. But I think that is the distinction that the question, is Kubernetes for developers, really turns on, right? Is that we have to figure out what type of developer we're asking this about. And once we have these two distinctions, right, I haven't gone through and thought about if the people working on brake systems should be worried about Kubernetes or not. That's a question for some other time, or not, maybe for an exercise for the reader. But I think if we have these two types, right, it's fun to kind of go through what is value and what is waste to app developers versus the ops developers, or kind of the SRE types, right? And I think that helps get clarity on like, oh, so it's really important when I'm building my platform for platforms to understand who's involved in it and who it's for, right? Who are the customers for it versus who's developing it. So one, generally, if you're an app developer, right? My dog strongly agrees, but generally, if you're an app developer, you going through planning of what your infrastructure and your platform is going to look like is not really very valuable, right? Because what's going to occur is you plan out, you go through that CNCF landscape, and you stand everything up, and then you're confronted with the application developer starting point, which is a blinking cursor, and then your real work begins, right? So everything you've gone up to planning and sorting through that, definitely necessary, but it's not the best use of an application developer's time. Now, part of that is figuring out how to integrate all these components that you're bringing together, and not only integrate all the stuff that you could get online or from excited vendors like us, but also integrating it with your own things, right? Like your own customs, your own ways, your own processes, your own organization, and how you're doing things. So a lot of that integration work is also not extremely valuable for application developers, right? Like if you've ever had to integrate with a back office ERP system to kind of pull inventory from a bunch of warehouses, you've had a mild version of this problem as an application developer, where you're kind of like, this really doesn't feel like valuable work. I just want the data, but I'm having to do all this work to integrate with the ERP system. And it gets, if you think even below the middleware area into infrastructure, it's just a whole bunch of that. Now, those two activities and these other ones, right? If you're a platform developer, that is what you focus on, right? So it's valuable for you to focus on that. And then product managing that, right? And this is the key that I'll get into a little bit of, I think, what defines an operations developer, an SRE person, a platform operator, beyond a traditional operations person, beyond a traditional sysadmin, or whatever you want to call them. Everyone has a different name for these roles. But this idea that if I'm building a platform, I'm building it for someone to use, right? So I have a customer. Those customers are developers, right? The developers have their own customers. And so when I'm building this platform, I need to product manage it. I need to pay attention to what my customers need, what my developers need. And in the same way that the developers on a quarterly, maybe even weekly basis are studying what the users of their system, what their customers are doing, the people building this platform and providing it, what I see in large organizations where the platforms are successful is they are also product managing that platform. They're looking at what developers need from it, and they're constantly evolving it. Now, to use a term from the old 2000s of Agile and Scrum think, there are other stakeholders, potentially customers. There's your compliance and your security people and things like that that you want to consider. But there's a pretty good set of customers, and if you think about product managing the platform, that becomes, again, if you're looking to move pixels on the screen, not really something you want your application developers spending time on, and instead what you want this other set of people to spend their time on. So then the last two, operating it. And this is, I'm always interested in hearing more and more and additional kind of ideas of the old if you write it, you run it sort of thing, right? One of the foundational things of DevOps. And I think um, finding out who's operating, who's running and monitoring and managing, to some extent, that's not really so valuable for app developers to do, right? Anytime they're spending troubleshooting and doing that, it's useful for them to not make those errors and to give them skin in the game to add more reliance and resiliency to their applications in the future, but maybe not as in depth as actually owning everything, starting from a blinking cursor and owning everything all the way down the stack. I think one of the things that's often missed about this concept of you write it, you own it, is there was almost an unspoken part that was like, assuming that you have a really good platform in place, that you're not just building everything from the dirt, right? And that's something that I think is often left off from that notion there. So, but once again, of course, operations people, that is part of what their issue is. Now, the next one, and when you work at a vendor like I do, you encounter this especially, right? Is there's always the question of who pays for the platform, right? Who pays for various components of things? And very often, developers will get involved in selecting the platform that you want, pushing you towards using Kubernetes or other technologies. And they might even start deploying and using those things. And then when it comes time to actually kind of like fund and pay for people to support that and for whatever other costs come in, mysteriously, like that friend that you love dearly, but you always don't want to go out to lunch or drinks with. You probably have one of these friends. Mysteriously, the check arrives at the table and you look around and you realize that your friend suddenly just had to go use the toilet and they're not there anymore. And this is kind of like the role that developers often have when it comes to funding things like your platform and your Kubernetes install, is they kind of sort of figure out a way not to have to actually pay for it and shift that off into someone else, usually the operations people. And this is the basis of one of the great reasons those two groups have such a fantastic relationship in organizations. They don't bear it like they do with their deal friend who they went to school with and therefore suffer through them. So how do we get to that point? Like how if we have this slightly, let's call this the late 2021 understanding of the answer of it depends, right? That answer being that Kubernetes is a platform for building platforms. A platform is as much of the stack of things that you need, from the infrastructure, from all of the kind of self-service IaaS stuff, handling networking, making sure it's secure and getting your networking done, to the middleware stack, even all the way up to the build pipelines and tools, and maybe even, depending on how you think about it, but most people do, the frameworks that developers use, right? The data sources and messaging systems, and maybe even your pagination system, depending on how platformy you want to be. But so if we're looking towards non-application developers to own and build this platform, how do people get there? How do you get started with that? And this is, I mentioned the books that I have. Like this is a small slice of the kind of things I like finding out from people and hearing about what they've done in large organizations. And the first one I've mentioned pretty thoroughly, but it's worth just highlighting again, is when you're setting up this platform program or strategy or effort or whatever, people really do take a product management approach to it, right? And I hear from a distressing amount of people who have set up a platform and they have not taken a product management approach. And they're often shocked that no developers have come to use their platform, right? And they just kind of came up with what they thought was needed and that oftentimes fit the other stakeholders' needs, right? What was secure and compliant. But they often forgot to ask the developers, the people who would be using the platform, what would be useful for them. I'm kind of overstating it. Of course, they've involved using it, but you want to involve them as frequently as you involve yourselves in it, right? They're your customers, the people that you want to study and try to provide what they need. Now, the other thing that I notice with these groups who stand up and run platforms is, and this is a general thing of all changing how you do IT and changing how your business works, your digital transformation, is pretty much all of their, let's say, macro level grained strategies and programs and priorities are always driven by a business case of some sort, right? So it's very rare that there's long-term success with saying like, well, we should just be using Kubernetes because it's the best way to run things, right? Like that might work for a little while, but then it doesn't really work for scaling to a large organization, scaling usage and scaling the budget that you have, because you need to generally at an organization talk about things in terms of the value it brings the organization, the benefits that it brings, because you could be doing something else, right? So a lot of these teams, very early on when they're standing up their platforms, they focus on how do we prove the business worth of it, whether it's for profit or not. But they're very focused on that. And if you think about the product management thing, if you're constantly asking and collecting from your developers what's useful for them and tracking if it helps the developers write and run their applications better, which if you think all the way back to the beginning, the better the developers are able to make their applications, the better the business is going to run, because the business is implemented by software. And so there's a very quick, very satisfying line when you go to that meeting for funding and to keep existing in your organization, to say that the platform that we provide, we can show you how it's provided value to developers and how it's provided value to the business, right? So it's really important that you figure out reporting, and not just reporting for a crass reason, but actually drive what you're doing there in that area. Now, the next two things are, and this is, as I said earlier, why I think it's easy to get a little too mischievous with the CNCF landscape, right? Like there actually are a lot of great options and innovations happening that if you bring in something like Kubernetes and you have a team dedicated to evolving it and making it into a platform that your developers use, there's all sorts of benefits that you can get from the overall community. I mean, this is one of the major points of open source, right? Is that there, as I forget which Sun person used to say it, but innovation happens elsewhere, and so you can benefit from that there as well. And then, of course, I'm biased, but I think us vendors do a pretty good job of helping add value to that as well. That kind of consolidating that out. So the next thing that I see people doing very frequently, and I advise on any sort of change, whether it's in your life or your IT or your digital transformation stuff, but particularly with something like Kubernetes and how complex it is and how it changes how developers work, is it's really important to start a lot smaller than you think you should. Almost like think about whatever your plans are and maybe do 10% of that for the first 6 or 12 months. Because what you'll need to, you're going to have to learn what works for you, and you're going to have to go through all that analysis, learn what your customers, what developers need to do, again, what works and not works. And if you do everything at once and you set too big of expectations, you're not really giving yourself much room for learning, right? Like we don't expect, a kindergartner, someone who's 5 or so and just starting school, to be able to write like a great PhD thesis on Proust or whoever you might think, right? Like it doesn't really come out that way. It takes time for them to go up to that. And I think with Kubernetes, depending on what surveys you look like, I think it's good to keep in mind that there is some urgency that you want to be prepared and take advantage of it. But, it's not like everyone is running every single workload right now in Kubernetes, right? There's very high penetration, which is to say, if you look at surveys in any given organization, there's someone is using Kubernetes, which can just mean one container running in one pod, running in one namespace, blah, 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 right? Like it just means that there's one instance in that entire organization. Now, typically it's a lot more than that, but you shouldn't pay attention to usage. You should pay attention to total amount of workloads that are running globally on Kubernetes. And that at the moment, and this is from Gartner, it varies who you look at, but I would basically estimate that anywhere between 5 to 15% of all enterprise workloads actually run in Kubernetes at the moment, right? Your online banking stuff, your thrilling factory systems, all that kind of stuff. So that means that this is the exact right time to start figuring out what your platform is going to be and to really get a handle of who Kubernetes is for and how you're going to build it out for developers. But just please don't try to do everything at once. Like don't be too ambitious, because that's the path to not working out at all. So finally, to that end, right? So here's a couple of things that I've noticed of late that are, so if we don't want developers running Kubernetes on their own, we want to keep them far from it and build something on top, right? There's a couple of things that I'm interested in nowadays, and are examples of it. There's many more out there, right? These are just the ones that I pay attention to. And one of them is I've recently looked back into Knative, which I think when it came out like 3 or 4 years ago, I remember reading through it and being very confused because it did a whole lot of different things. And this was always also at the height of like serverless. And I remember reading through serverless things and being like, oh man, that sounds great for a few use cases, but I don't know how I'm going to implement like, an online banking system in serverless. Like that seems like there's something else going on in there. But since then, I think by adding in and focusing on using cloud native build packs and looking at some of the work that we do and also organizations like Trigger Mesh do, Knative has really become a pretty good instance of one of the ways you would want developers to work with and interact with Kubernetes, right? It tries to walk that line between compromising functionality and really just kind of throwing them in the deep end of YAML, the thing people complain with. I think I've waited this long before I've said the word YAML, which is some sort of accomplishment in a Kubernetes talk. And then also, we have another version of this. You can kind of see one kind of picture of it called the Tanzu Application Platform. It pulls together a whole bunch of open source projects and what we would call conventions, templates, ways that you have developers set up and run their applications. If you're familiar with Spring Boot, it's kind of like that, but for Kubernetes. And then finally, if you're really interested in like just totally going into developers not knowing anything about your infrastructure, it's worth your time to look into the Cloud Foundry world and see what's going on in there. There's sometimes you can run it on Kubernetes, sometimes you don't even do that. But there's a pretty rock solid 7 years of people providing that platform to developers, and a lot of lessons to be learned from there, or just using it on its own if you're interested. So I think for late 2021 calendar year, my conclusion is that we still have a little bit of it depends, but at least we know that it depends on the type of developer that we're talking about, right? I think there's some better clarification on that. And I think also, since I last checked in on this, several years have gone by, and I think there's actually some lessons from tech companies, right? But also from just regular, gigantic, global enterprises about trying to use this stuff and see how you can make it work for your application developers, and how you can start thinking about the developers who probably should be using Kubernetes, those platform developers. So with that, thanks. I appreciate you, listening in. And, hopefully I got across that I, this is more like pondering than I try not to have any sort of like strong opinion strongly held, just sort of mushy things tastefully held. But I'm always interested in figuring out what other people's experiences are and what they've encountered and all sorts of things like that. So I think we have got a little time for Q&A if people are interested.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. That's like a great overview of state where Kubernetes is for developers or not these days. And couple of follow-up questions. So do you see that this, like, let me say it, like Kubernetes-based platform or like application experience platform should be something that is mandated within organizations in order to be successful, or it's a pure choice? And they just need to be like so good, so every developer in an org will want it.
Yeah. I mean, I think. So the second is kind of like the Netflix model, right? And I talked to a Netflix person about this 6-7 years ago, so I don't know if it's still the case. I mean, it's still echoed here and there, but that like you need to make your platform so great that developers will use it. And I think that is definitely what you should do with the big asterisk. And when that asterisk is like to the best of your ability, right? Like, and it kind of gets to that product management thing, right? Like developers are really good that if they can't get what they want very quickly, I mean, they're the ones who write software. They will write software to get around it, right? And they're also mischievous, and so they'll figure out a way to make people realize, until it's too late that they've done this. Now, that said, I think that we'll call it the Netflix approach. I think that's fine if you're like a tech company or like a small company, but a lot of these companies where they can follow that practice are like 5, 20, maybe 30 years old. Right. And most of them do like 1 to 5 things, right? Like even if you think about Netflix, obviously it has tons of different applications on the back end and things like that, but it kind of sort of does one thing, right? Like, you know, generating its original content aside, but it has one thing that it does with technology that's very important. So it's a lot simpler than like, if you look at, for example, most banks nowadays that in the past 10 years are actually not only themselves, whatever name they call themselves, a 50, 100+ year institution, but have also acquired like 1 to 10 other 50 to 100-year institutions, right? And so when you get to that kind of complexity in your software, or even just like a power utility company, right? Like most regular organizations, their estate of software is so complicated, and it has so much going on that at some point you have to start mandating the use of something, right? And you can't just let people go out and do whatever they want, uh, because they'll probably, because it reminds me of a phrase. I forget where this comes from, but it's the guidance that I like to use is this trite phrase of like, you don't want it to be the developer's mistake and now your problem, right? Like it's so it really is worth focusing on finding that middle ground between, we're going to mandate the use of this, right, in a very responsible way, but we also are going to, our responsibility is to make sure that we are product managing it to be the best possible thing that we can deliver, instead of just like what we delivered 2 years ago. Right? Like that's kind of the way I would judge things.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. So this internal platform, it's always should be a product. It's not different from anything else, like any other service or experience we deliver, right? And recently, and even in a Puppet State of DevOps report, there are like a lot of conversations about IDPs, like internal development platforms,
yeah,
which are actually going beyond just like runtime, just Kubernetes. So what's your take on that? Is it like we're trying to do too many things at once, or it's like a natural transition from like other steps or other basically aspects of software development?
Yeah. I only encountered that term recently. So and I read through it in a very shallow way. So
Mm-hmm.
my shallow answer is like, yeah, I mean, I think that's the same thing. Now, as always, I'm sure there's a lot of footnotes to be had there. But yes, I mean, if the goal is that we have a bunch of developers writing our own software to run the business, right? And they need to run that software on a thing, on a runtime environment. It needs to have a standard set of middleware. We need to make sure it's compliant. We want to, we want to make sure they can focus as much as possible on their own application stuff. Then, yeah, I mean, that is what a platform team is, right? And I think, you know, most of the large organizations I talk with, they do have a team like that, right? Like just because of what we call it in, at Pivotal and then at VMware Tanzu, we call them a platform operations team, right? All sorts of names for these teams. Doesn't really matter, right? Like what they do is what matters. But those teams are figuring out how to build a platform. Now, whether or not they build everything on their own is one thing. Whether or not they pull together a bunch of different components that are open source or things they wrote on their own or things that they bought or they're in public or private cloud or whatever, like that's all sort of determined by what the team needs and what they want to do and what's available. But generally, yeah, they are. I generally think this team does a lot more integrating of existing things than like,
Mm-hmm.
opening up an IDE and staring at a blank page. but they are building an internal platform for people to use.
Awesome. And so we have a like very diverse audience. So people from big enterprises like financial institutions. We have folks working for companies going like cloud native day one, and some of them may or may not have that kind of teams or
Sure.
like this like formed direction to have a platform team to like really work on internal platform. So what will be your recommendations on where to start? So what sort of conversations they need to have to like really kick off this like initiative internally?
Yeah. I mean, if we're talking about, let's say, a group of like 10 people, including like, the receptionist at the desk, right? So you've got like so really we're talking about maybe like 2 or 3 technical people, right? Uh, I mean, there's two things. One, you have to get something that is already made, right? Like, and whether that means you go to like a cloud service, or you look at like using one of our wonderful VMware Tanzu things, which is easy to do nowadays, or whatever. Like, you want to start with something that already exists, right? Because I think
Mhm.
I didn't go into this too much, but one of the main problems that people get into, I kind of alluded to this with planning, is they get stuck in like analysis paralysis, right? There's so many options. And is this the case? But I almost feel like this would be a fun theory to think about, is I almost think the fewer people in a conversation, the longer it takes to make a decision, like a technical decision, because everyone can like forcefully argue their point and they get interested in all these things. So I think it's really important to, if you've got like this very, very small thing, just pick an application and say, like, our goal over the next month or week or whatever is to deploy this application. We're just going to pick something, right? And let's deploy it on this and see if it works. We can do like 1 week of analysis, but we got to time box it and pick a thing and deploy. And if it doesn't work, let's analyze again, right? So this is the whole like setting up learning and starting small and learning things. Now, the other thing that often happens, and this is why, you know, there's so many great startups in the CNCF landscape, is if you don't have that kind of, if you don't know that you're going to have to avoid the trap of the following, you'll end up in it, which is one of those developers is going to end up being your operations person. They're just going to be like full-time dedicated to building your platform, and that's going to be their job for the rest of their life at your company. And maybe if your company is successful, they'll probably stay there. And if they're not successful, they'll go and like get some VC funding and form a startup around like this great platform that they had, right? And you see this over and over again, right? I mean, obviously that's a little, to use the word again, flippant. But you know, you really need to be aware that like if you don't start with something, you're going to have to build it. And then you're going to encounter all these issues that I was going over. And you know, it might even be in like a 3-person team. It kind of might be this ideal setup. You can follow the old extreme programming principle of like the customer can be in the room. But then you're going to have like, you know, the head of sales come into the room and be like, so you're programming YAML and we're supposed to be selling like clear braces to people. Like, what are you doing? Right? Like, I'd like you to work. We hired you to work on moving pixels on the screen. So it's something to be leery of. Now, when you go to a medium-sized organization, let's say 50 to 500 developers, I don't know. Whatever you think of as medium depends on your industry and what you do. Like, I mean, I think once you get to that standpoint, yeah, you need to set up a platform team that starts going through all of this stuff and thinks about consolidating it. And I mean, definitely once you're in a large organization, I already commented on that. like, the longer you wait to go through the painful work of centralizing like a century of of IT, like the worse it's going to be. So you just got to like start working on it and centralize as much as possible.
Awesome. Thank you so much for recommendations. I guess we covered like pretty much every case that our audience may have. So with that, let's conclude the session and move to a Zoom room for a discussion. So for a further discussion, and we'll see you there. Thanks a lot for the talk.